one of the great divides that we have is there seem to be a lot of people who care a lot about spirit and heart and love and care, but are often at odds with technology because they haven't seen how that fits together. And they've seen all of the examples that we've created of technologies that are at odds with love and care and well-being. And so they set themselves at war with technology. And then all the technologists who were like, well, we have these powerful tools that allow us to solve all these world problems, but they don't know how to understand things like spirits and God and care and love in a way that is not only compatible, but coherent with all of our deepest scientific understanding. And so this is like the essence of this technological love project that I've come to pursue, is trying to stitch this all together. I think I've made a lot of progress, but I'm fighting with my own demons around figuring out how to actually get that into the world. And it's also quite an ambitious project.
Welcome to episode 25 of Humans on the Move. I'm your host, Michael Garfield. Technology is an extension of human will, the means by which we enhance our leverage. But leverage over what? Over the last century, it has become increasingly apparent that our efforts to innovate our way to greater power and control bring us no closer to the perfection of a frictionless, convenient, and orderly world. Every tool adds to the ever greater, larger pool of recombinant possibility and exponential surprise. Risk and uncertainty haven't gone away. They've just been redistributed. The further we see, the more we realize our non-separation. The more value we extract, the greater our externalities. But what if we approach technology through an ethic of care? What if we strove to make the built environment an embodiment of love? What if we accepted the way our tools shape us and used them to increase our sensitivity to their impact and consequence? This week, we hear from Larry Muhlstein, who worked at Responsible AI at Google and DeepMind before leaving to found the Holistic Technology Project. In Larry's words, care is crafted from understanding, respect, and will. Once care is deep enough and in a generative reciprocal relationship, it gives rise to self-expanding love. My work focuses on creating such systems of care by constructing a holistic socio-technical tree with roots of philosophical orientation, a trunk of theoretical structure, and technological leaves and fruit that offer nourishment and support to all parts of our world. I believe that we can grow love through technologies of togetherness that help us to understand, respect, and care for each other. I am committed to supporting the responsible development of such technologies so that we can move through these trying times towards a world where we are all well together." End quote. In this episode, Larry and I explore the roots of philosophical orientation and trunk of theoretical structure, asking how technologies for reality, perspectives, and karma can help us grow a world in love. What is just enough abstraction? When is autonomy desirable? And when is it a false god? What do property and selfhood look like in a world where the ground truths of our inner being shape design and governance? It's a long, deep conversation on fundamentals we need to reckon with if we are to live in futures we actually want. I hope you enjoy it as much as we did. Be sure to visit the show notes for a list of mentioned resources and links to support our ongoing work. The show is just the tip of the iceberg. So much vital discourse is going on in the Discord server and other spin-off groups around these dialogues, and I hope to find you there. Thanks for listening. Larry, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. Super excited.
All right, so I want to take this at a casual pace, and I want listeners to get to know you and your story and the autobiographical details that bring us into context about your work and why it is that you care about what you do. And I've actually gotten a lot of mileage out of asking people about the personal hardship that they've endured in their lives, to
Yeah.
the extent that you and I recognize this relationship between technology and power or leverage, and what compels a person to consider things deeply, etc. So have at it.
There's a lot of potential ways to enter this.
Start at the beginning.
Yeah, well, the beginning, I believe that there's no real such thing as a beginning. Beginnings are when we choose to label them. So let's see. I think I'll start in now, which is a more defined moment. So now I am this person. I recently left a role at Google DeepMind working on responsible artificial intelligence and am now running this fledgling thing called the Holistic Technology Project, which is like a consultancy around how to grow a world that is in well being and how to do that by supporting the development of technologies that are net good for both the whole Earth system and all of its parts. And then, as part of this project, I'm working on this big philosophical, theoretical, and technological system called technological love, which is about how we can support more love in the world and really how to get all of the pieces of the world resonating and intertwined in some sort of system of love. And I can explain later what that all means via technology. And I think I agree with a lot of the Buddhists and the Beatles and all the people that love is the answer. And I believe that in a pretty principled way. And I think that the only real way to make that happen is via the support of particularly designed technological systems. I can go backwards now from that as to like, why do I care about this? And, I think like many of us, I've lived a complicated life full of my share of beautiful things, full of my share of pain and hardship. Let's see. Some significant components of my life have been a lot of health challenges that I've had to deal with throughout my entire life, basically since I was 10. That has shaped a lot of my path for both better and worse, both really derailing me in lots of ways and then also giving me deeper opportunities for new kinds of perspectives and really to like understand, I think, more of why the world is as it is. And I really believe that the world is in a great disease right now. And that disease is, in one sense, like this Buddhist kind of like dis-ease thing where things are not functioning in a way that is easeful or healthy or well for most of the parts. And that it's also in this medical sense, like it's sick, it's coughing and dying and rotting and burning. I mean, I lived in LA for a little over a year, and this week I've been really feeling a lot of pain, like many of us, around watching so many beautiful parts of LA burn and so many people suffer and so many just like dreams and possibilities and go up in smoke with the literal fire. And I think that we need to approach our time in the world right now as a healing process. And my own healing process has involved both these physical kinds of disease things, as well as this whole journey of trying to figure out who I am and what my role in the world is. I've, I think, always had some sort of pull towards something specific, but not previously defined. So I've had to make a lot of my own way. My and I was originally in high school, like going to become a mechanical aerospace engineer. I always loved flying and building things and fixing things. And some series of events happened where I got an opportunity to explore artificial intelligence as early as the summer before my senior year. And just was blown away by how beautiful the theory is and what kinds of like really solid principles we can extract about the nature of intelligence, the nature of action and observation in the world, and how it all relates together. prediction, all sorts of things, both from a philosophical side, a mathematical side, and a like design implementation side. Like you can actually build these things and they work. Even back then, there were a lot of things that people could build, machine learning, and it worked. And I got the opportunity to build in high school this machine learning solver for the game Helicopter. It would learn the game where you just click the space bar and it goes up, and you let go of the space bar and it goes down, and the cave has this different shape, and you try to like get it to not hit things. And me and some people at Rutgers, or this like New Jersey governor school, we like got to build this through reinforcement learning, like reading reinforcement learning textbooks and implementing this with the guidance of some professors from Rutgers and around the country. And that really shifted my path to becoming both like a computer scientist and a cognitive scientist and a philosopher and whatever it is that I am now that I still don't really have a label for. I then went to do an undergrad where I was doing computer science and cognitive science, and then just wanted to do more things and fill in all the pieces where I was curious and it felt like there was something interesting and I didn't understand. So I took classes, and eventually I had to make up my own major because the only way to fit everything together was by like inventing this major in embodied intelligence, which was really amazing that I had the opportunity to do that. This was at Case Western, so really grateful for them. And then I did most of a PhD in cognitive science, which was also very multidisciplinary kind of thing. And the thing with these multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary kinds of programs, especially back then, but probably still to this day, is that I think that they allow you to pursue a much more accurate and complete picture and less biased picture of the way the world works, because you're not held in silos and you're not being constrained by one particular perspective or one particular set of tools from a specific discipline. But there is not always a lot of guidance for how to make use of that, whether it's in your education or in the world. So I went through a lot of challenge about both kind of having to lead and direct my own education in a lot of ways. I had the support of a lot of amazing people, and I really had to figure it out and bumped into a lot of walls and had a lot of challenges. And all my colleagues did as well, and my peers. And we all ended up on our own paths. And that path eventually took me out of academia and into industry because I was really interested in actually applying things to real problems in the world and not just thinking about problems, but like figuring out how do we build something that actually works and is useful. And this is where I get really inspired by a lot of the beautiful technology of maybe the Web 2 days, like Google search and a lot of early Google products where they did manage to, as they say, like make information useful and accessible and really reshape the way that the world works. Also things like Wikipedia and all of the free software, open source kinds of movements, et cetera. But really at my heart has always been this more philosophical way of being. I always felt that what we've been investing in insufficiently, especially these days as we speed up in the way that we approach things, is just really deep understanding of how the world works. And I think that we can't really get reliable solutions to things until we understand the thing. I mean, our world is so complex that if you were to understand a piece of it or understand it to some degree, and then say, I've reduced the risk a reasonable amount, and therefore I think that there's a solution we can implement. We can't just sit around and pursue understanding. We need to build something. Like chances are you don't understand it enough. And amongst all the complexity, you're probably going to cause more problems. And I think there's ways to control for this. And I mean, this like consulting practice that I have slash whatever it wants to become, holistic technology project, I've invested in figuring out how to control for that without having to solve for everything all at once, all of the time. But I really believe that if we're going to solve what I've been coming to call the great disease, which is like another spin on thinking about what others have called the meta crisis, but really seeing it as a connected system that is sick. I think we really need to understand it. And so I've been pursuing since grad school and since before that, just a connected web of understanding both fundamentals of things like learning theory. I think that there's parts of like foundations of statistics that we don't understand that are getting in our way of being able to do more generalized science, for instance, and things like communication theory. I think we don't really understand what it means for me to communicate with a being that has different experience and meanings associated with actions and perceptions and words and symbols than I do. And that understanding that more thoroughly allows us to build tools that facilitate this kind of communication. And I think we now have the technology to do that. So we just are really missing the philosophy. And also things like spirituality and things like ethics. I think that all of this can be understood in a way that is coherent and fits together. And I see one of the great divides that we have is there seem to be a lot of people who care a lot about spirit and heart and love and care, but are often at odds with technology because they haven't seen how that fits together. And they've seen all of the examples that we've created of technologies that are at odds with love and care and well-being. And so they set themselves at war with technology. And then all the technologists who were like, well, we have these powerful tools that allow us to solve all these world problems, but they don't know how to understand things like spirits and God and care and love in a way that is not only compatible, but coherent with all of our deepest scientific understanding. And so this is like the essence of this technological love project that I've come to pursue, is trying to stitch this all together. I think I've made a lot of progress, but I'm fighting with my own demons around figuring out how to actually get that into the world. And it's also quite an ambitious project. So there's been lots going on there, but I've been making a lot of progress lately, both with the project and with my own personal battles. And I feel very optimistic about the future of me being able to really give a lot more to the world in these ways. And here we are.
Here we are. I want to set you up to talk a little bit more about the definitional and fundamental components of all of this. Because in your writing, it's not exactly axiomatic, I guess. Everything that you write is very structured. But first, we must define the concepts. And then you've got on the website where you've laid out the conceptual core of technological love. It's your own hyperlinked. I like how a simple essay often doesn't say enough to contribute to a broad understanding, whereas a complex essay tends not to get written or read. The structure of this site is intended to mimic the natural structure of the theory itself, which obviously, as somebody who is obsessed with exploring idea networks, really appealed to me. But it's not just the hyperlinks in the text itself, but every time you pull up an idea, you can see the cloud of related concepts. Starting there and bearing that in mind, as like I did with K. Alato McDowell, being like, okay, we're going to, over the course of this conversation, cut a low dimensional vector embedding pathway through this thicket of related stuff. It seems like the place to start here is, I want to just read 2 bits off of this site and then give you the chance to expand on those as you see fit, link them to your other core ideas, and then carry that relay to somewhere else in this. So you say, we aim to control the future in order to make it more predictable, more legible. But in the process, we introduce disease. And this disease gives us a predictable but unhealthy world. And elsewhere, like most diseases, addiction does not originate in an individual or in a vice, but in the properties of the system. A system where people are incentivized to make money at the cost of the health of others and the world will give rise to a plethora of vices, shiny, tempting, and available at the push of a button. A world where selflessly helping others is costly and difficult is a world where there will never be quite enough help available. A world where those who are suffering are seen as weaker or less worthy of our care is a world that will only breed loneliness, disconnection, and disease. So to take those and then just to call the long arc that I see possible for us here, you gave me a lengthy draft of an essay on reality technologies, which I think is an area of special concern to me. The issue of if we don't know what's real, how do we coordinate our behavior? How do we act according to our values, which is something that comes up a lot on this show. So I think just to note that I think when someone sets themselves up in opposition to the diseased system that is kind of like ironically symptomatic of what you and I might diagnose as the underlying issue, which is a disconnect between our ability to perceive and our ability to act on the rest of the world that is in a very deep and important way not separate from ourselves. And yet the technologies that we've made as mundane as the ability to see news coming in from all over the world without being able to act in response in any kind of meaningful way to the suffering of other beings, or in more or less obvious and more pernicious ways, like the ways that we calculate economic value. The opposite of that is like we have this extraordinary leverage over the world through the rendering calculable and operable through our mathematical systems and our monetary systems that never fully account for the illegible value that actually exists in the world, that the world is bigger than any account of it. And so even the most well-intended efforts are going to create consequences that we cannot foresee. A lot of this show is dedicated to exploring the middle of this ground between these two extents of high agency, low understanding or perception, and then high perception, low agency. And in the middle, to talk about holistic technologies and disease at the same time invokes the relationship between holistic medicine and allopathic medicine. That I read your stuff and you talk about karma in here. You talk about karma technologies in your work. I think of Carl Schroeder's short story that he wrote for ASU's Project Hieroglyph, where he had policymakers in his fictional future British Columbia wear haptic vests into the forest where their policies were going to devastate the ecological diversity. And there was a prosthetic sense of
Mm.
imminent relationality with all of these beings that were made suddenly and viscerally sensible through technology and invoked a clear sense of what was at stake. So I don't know, I've given you another huge tangle of stuff to work through.
Yeah. Thank you. There's a lot there. I don't necessarily know where to start.
Let's start with you're a fan of Bayesian thinking. When I hear you say that if you feel like you understand enough and that it's time to act, that bad things often happen. And
Mm.
that's a simple way of gesturing toward everything that I've been saying, that it seems like the reason this show exists is to encourage the set of practices by which understanding is not something that you either train everything at the very beginning and then you just let the model run, nor is it something that the search for meaning isn't something that you postpone until you have successfully executed the resource accumulation algorithm. You've achieved everything you want to in your career. That there's a sense in which, for instance, I'm always thinking about the high stakes situation where you're lost in the woods. And it's, if you don't know how to orient yourself, you will not survive. And so people tend to think of these things as moments along some sort of developmental arc. but there's a sense in which survival, success, and significance are reflected in one another or are woven together at every moment of the process. So, yeah, just thinking about what prediction and understanding have
Yeah.
to do with one another in your thinking is seems like a tangible
Yes.
spot.
Let's do the prediction and understanding thing. And let's, I think, start with the question of how do we act in a way that is reliably good amongst all this complexity? Like, how do we not get paralyzed by complexity or risk or all of this when it is an open system and you can never measure that for sure? So, the way that I like to think about this, and I haven't written about this in a little while, so I'm not recalling if I derived a real principle, like a mathematical thing here yet. I think maybe I did, or at least I got like most of the way. I think there is a mathematical thing here. But basically, when we act, we have the sphere of influence in some sense. There's butterfly effect says that your literal sphere of influence is the entire world system, but the sphere of influence of things that you can actually reliably affect in a way that is different meaningfully from the pattern that is going to occur otherwise. So we need to think about this concept in chaos theory of the emergent patterns and structures and the actual literal dynamics of molecules, for instance. So the effect that I have, for instance, of let's say like choosing to recycle a can or throw it in the trash on the full dynamics of the system is somewhat predictable, but not massive in that assuming our recycling systems are built reasonably and like that our trash systems are built in a way that is not sustainable, it is going to be better for the earth system for me to allow this metal to be reused so that we don't have to go extract more aluminum from the earth, for instance. And when making decisions like that, you can look at what is my expected influence, what is my understanding of that, and what is the cost to taking that action. And in this case, I'm in Berkeley, recycling is very easy, like the cost is very low of this kind of thing. The expected impact is positive, but not massive, and clearly dwarfs the cost. And therefore, it is like it makes sense to recycle a can. For things that are a lot more complicated, what happens if we build this new AI technology and unleash it on the world? Or like a problem that has been faced recently of should we open source this AI technology or should we keep it closed within the boundaries of our corporation that we believe to maybe have better understanding of the ethics around this thing than other people? Maybe I just back myself in a corner here. Let's see if I can answer this thoughtfully. But you want to look at the expected, and this may be too big to analyze like this, but generally, if try an abstraction without a specific example and see if it is coherent, you want to analyze the expected sphere of influence and really stay on the side of your understanding. So, examples that I think about sometimes, I have this essay that I drafted a while ago that I haven't published that I need to get to called Technologies of Power and Understanding. And it's about, all technology basically acts as a lever to amplify the amount of influence that we have on the world. And our problems that we have are really due to our technologies because without technology, we wouldn't have enough influence to cause climate change, for instance. And when we do things like, let's say, cut down the rainforest or hydraulically mine rivers in California, we have this short term local value gain. In the rainforest case, you have more farmland, more like an even simpler case than this is using nitrogen fertilizers to farm with. So you get more crop yield in the short term if you use nitrogen fertilizers, but you cause that nitrogen to run off into the rivers, which harms the river ecosystem. And they have remarkably severe consequences on the stability of our earth system. And it also accelerates runoff of soil, et cetera. And that soil takes way longer to create than it does to destroy. And so in cases like this, we have enough understanding to know that it's like a question of short-term versus long-term impact. Maybe when we initially created the technology, we didn't have enough understanding. But when you do something like create this whole new chemical manufacturing process and put it in all of the soil and all of the planet, and you don't really understand the impact of this, we need to figure out how to notice first. I don't understand really what's going to happen. And I don't think that we're unable to notice this. I think we're unable to sufficiently care about this and take it into account in the economic systems that prevail. So I think even at that time, there were probably people who were like, is this a good idea? I mean, when I read about these periods, I hear that there usually were people who questioned it, but they were silenced in some form or just ignored for a while. And we have these things today as well. And so the question should be like, what is the extent of the understanding that I have of the impact? And how can I dial down the extent of my impact? Maybe by starting somewhere small and trying experiments, maybe by using a less disruptive technology initially, etc., such that I can still gather more information and try it because maybe there is something good, but not have this huge profile of risk. And so if we're just looking at this like power versus understanding thing, I'd have to spend a little more time mathematizing this, and maybe other people have already done that. But it's not so crazy to just look at how do we keep our power below our threshold of understanding, which is from a Bayesian perspective, really just like talking about how we update our beliefs and therefore our best understanding using evidence in a way that is rational and unbiased by our desires and our fears and all of the other things that influence how we act. Is the belief that this is going to be good when you take as much as you can into account clearly on the side of it's going to be good without risking too much of the other side such that it's worth taking this action. And there's all sorts of complexity about this, about like risk, especially because there's cataclysmic risk that you always have to some degree and how much is too much. But there's also just a sense of this is clearly likely to be net good. And let's pursue this objectively and try to work together to both increase our understanding and improve the world at the same time. And I think if we really manage to pursue that path, it really does lead us to better solutions. And the things that get in the way are all of these fears and attachments and lack of mutual understanding, which manifests in inability to communicate, inability to work together, inability to care for each other, inability to construct incentive structures such that everyone is going to be better off and everyone is supported and gets what they need in all the senses of everyone. And I don't know where you want to go from here, but there's all sorts of directions. And the branching of all of this kind of thing is one of the reasons I decided to make this technological love website in a way that is interlinked. This is just like a alpha or pre-alpha version online right now, but it is available because they figured I might as well share it and get some feedback. So thank you for looking at that. And I don't really know if I've talked with anybody about it yet. So this is
Yeah. Yeah. So you and I are members of a Signal chat, Andrew Dunn's group on wise innovation. And a while back, without naming names, you and I ended up in one side of a dispute over the value of statistics. For reasons I sympathize with, but disagree with, someone in that channel was basically saying that statistics are evil. And you and I took issue with this. And I think for the same reasons, but I want to get into the notion that the processes by which we abstract and aggregate information so that we can see big patterns in it, I think you and I both recognize as necessary. You have a kind of an apologia for the only way out is through at the end of your draft on reality technologies, where you say, as long as we continue to have modern industry weaponry and any technology that amplifies our powers, we must retain our ability to perceive and communicate in a trustable way. So, this is the bind I want to explore with you, because the motivation to say statistics are evil is, and I talked about this with Joshua DiCalio in my conversation with him as well, on scale and the transformations of consciousness that you have available by really deeply contemplating scale. Is that he's got a great section in that book on biophysical scaling laws, like Jeffrey West's work. And a lot of stuff in complex systems science depends on the observation of these statistical patterns. But there is a huge difference that you've already pointed to on recognizing the what of the pattern, even if it is a trustworthy pattern, if the data is solid, and then understanding the causal underpinnings for that data. And this person in the chat was basically saying that abstraction vexes the issue of care for entities as singular, the care that emerges through, as you put it in your writing for Hurry Up, We're Dreaming, you say, for me to care for a being, I must understand their essence and what it is for them to be happy, healthy, and harmoniously coexistent with their environment. For example, to care for a plant, I must first listen to what it needs to be well. But if you're looking at socio-physical models of human behavior at the scale of society, you can care for society, but you can't care for people as singular entities. And so this is the catch that I think you and I acknowledged, and we're trying to say, yes, this is true, but what are we going to do? Because again, to jump back to reality technologies, you say the defining role of technology is to extend our powers. It allows us to perceive and affect the world more than we could with our bodies alone. If we retain the ability to use technology to widely affect the world, then we must retain an ability to perceive the nature of these effects. So DiCalio and I spent some time in our conversation talking about the fact that this issue of understanding emergent phenomena, understanding that to know something at one scale does not confer the same kind of knowledge at other scales. And this is what I was talking about earlier when I was saying that a lot of the suffering that we experience through a perceived lack of agency, a disconnection between our ability to witness this flood of information and our ability to act upon it. So, I mean, maybe this is all just to lead you back into a simpler articulation of care and understanding and then will, as you lay out on Hurry Up, We're Dreaming. But I just want to say that rather than talking about the military industrial complex or capitalism or whatever, I see this every day in trying to teach my son cause and effect. That it's like, look, in the moment, you want to hit your sister, and hitting makes you feel like you have some control over this situation. But you need to learn that if you hit somebody, they are very likely to hit you back. And his predictive horizon hasn't grown that far
Mhm.
yet. Again, there's a lot for you to work with, but go for
Yes.
it.
Well, I also tend to learn about these things not by thinking so much about the big abstractions like the military industrial complex, but by observing patterns and problems and challenges in my own life or in lives of friends, and then try to find the underlying essence and abstract it in a way where it's clean and makes enough sense and applies to enough different scenarios that I can then start to ask, how does this apply to the big things? And when you do this well, you get something that does apply across all scales. And so that's a lot of the intention of these principles and definitions and things, including care and love and understanding. But of course, articulating something that is general enough is quite challenging. So then I've put a lot of energy into really trying to get super clear about as much as possible, which is a lot of why this is taking a long time. In things like this site, I have put a lot of energy into, what I mean by care. So my definition of care is to support the well-being of a being. And well-being, support, and being are all defined specifically as well. And well-being is very personal or individual. Like what it is for me to be well is different than what it is for you to be well. However, we happen to have a lot of things about this in common because we're both humans, we both live in the United States, etc. But what it is for me to be well is more different from what it is for a tree in my neighborhood to be well. Yet there are still things in common. And it's not beyond our understanding to understand what it is for a tree to be well and therefore to support that. But it might be beyond our initial understanding unless we decide to pursue and listen and learn about trees and like what is actually good for them and how do they thrive and when are they happy, when are they willing to give of themselves in various ways like fruits or like branches or even to be cut down to be used for structures. I think that for something like a tree, it's very hard for me. I mean, I haven't spent my entire life trying to learn about trees. I really love trees and spend as much time as I really can with them. But I think for me, it's really hard to know when do I cut this tree down if it's, for instance, like needed for lumber for a house or if it's in the way of something. And the best we can do is really invest as much as we can in understanding both their well-being and the well-being of the systems that they're a part of. So the tree's not going to live forever, and I'm not going to live forever, and none of the things in our world will be in their current form forever. So it's not like complete sacrilege for things to die or be killed, in my opinion. As humans, we have to kill to eat in some form. So the question, as all hard questions, becomes like a nuanced, subtle one, and it's very individual. And so pursuing that understanding of well-being is what allows you to support the well-being of that being, which is what allows you, therefore, to care and therefore to get into relationships of love, which we can talk about a little later. And so you were asking at the beginning, I think, about how do we both care for the individuals that compose the system and the whole system itself. And I think that we care for the whole by creating structures and support systems, et cetera, usually through technologies and often, I think, by affecting the economic incentive structures, et cetera, which is what government does, for instance, that allow us to care for the individuals together. So it's not just the individuals. I can't really care for me separately from the other people in my neighborhood. It's how do we care for how do we build things in a way that is good for me and my neighbors and everyone else in different parts and niches in the neighborhood ecosystem, or the Berkeley ecosystem, or the Bay Area, or California, or United States, or the whole Earth, such that all of our unique needs for well-being are respected and understood and supported in a way that like fits into a puzzle, because an ecosystem is really a puzzle where everything has a niche and fits together and plays a role and supports one another. And I think that when you have something that like a healthy ecosystem, everything becomes more easeful. And this is really the essence of what love is a system where each component is supporting the well-being of other components, such that if you're a component, you find yourself generally supported and generally in a position to be able to support other components in a way that is relatively easeful. But if we upset the balance of the ecosystem, whether it's like a natural ecosystem or a socio-technical ecosystem or some other kind of like complex modern structure, then it becomes really hard for the individuals. And so, like when I think about this problem of how do we care for the individuals together, it's like, how do we create a technological system that is accountable to the individuals, or really, I don't think individuation is really even possible. So like the pieces, however we divide them, and often you have to make some choices, and that's fine. For a while, we're going to choose to define me based on my body and probably based on things that I articulate about myself. And you'll have to pick boundaries more or less for each kind of thing that you're going to care about. And then how do we solve for the joint systems problem such that I get what I need: food, water, shelter, opportunity to socialize, opportunity to make my own choices in my life, freedom, etc. But such that this is not just true for me, but for others. So, an obvious thing to me, which I guess it took some time to extract this as a kind of essential thing, is we need to make it such that I pay a cost if I'm going to do something that is harmful to others. And this is captured more or less by the economic concept of the externality. And the problem, one of the really essential problems that we have is that in so many cases, I don't pay that cost. I can just do things that impact others, whether it's other people, whether it's the ecosystem or the environment or my neighborhood or my town or something. And if I find solutions such that I derive benefit from taking those actions that cost things to others, then I'm going to choose those things, and then everybody's going to have to pay the price. And then everybody is in a situation where they're less well off and therefore less able to take good actions themselves. And in order to account for being poorly off, they need to take more radical actions towards protecting themselves because they don't have what they need. And those more radical actions are achievable often only, or at least far more easily, by doing things that hurt others. And this is where we found ourselves, where often the only these like obviously viable action is to hurt others. And so many of us are either we get numb to this or we feel the pain of this. And so we try to isolate ourselves. This is why I think a lot of people try to live separate from society, is like they feel the pain from this, or they just somehow decide that they don't care. And then they gain all sorts of other embedded psychological traumas and whatever. And it's all because that is the solution concept that emerges from the current economic incentive structures. And I think that we can fix that by figuring out how do we price all of those externalities in a way that makes it so that it is in my best interest for Larry to do something that is also in the best interest of the whole system. And I don't think that this is impossible. It is quite a large scale endeavor, but if we work together on developing this thing, we can really solve the world's problems. And this is what I'm trying to write about in my technological love work and in this book that I'm writing called The Technological Way of Being in Love. I, like many others these days, find myself in my own personal version of this challenge where in order for me to do this thing, which I believe to be best for the world, it requires often great personal sacrifice. And finding that path where I can continue to make reliable progress towards this goal while continuing to support myself and my own well being, which was required for me to make reliable progress towards this goal, is remarkably hard. And so I think you often, it feels like sometimes find yourself in a similar situation where you really have dedicated your life to doing what you believe to be good for the world. And it's way harder because of the world that we're in and the like economic structures and everything that I just described. It's way harder to do that and sometimes feels impossible to do that. And yet there is no other way. What are we going to give up on the world? So we have to figure it out. And I remain hopeful that as I get better at this, as hopefully I get more of like my story and like this kind of work and like the importance of this and like the elegance of this approach out, I find more and more people who sympathize with this and also like want to work on it together. And then if we're working on it together, we're all supporting each other. We find ourselves in a network of more support. We find ourselves therefore with things being more easeful, and then we can make more progress and things start to accelerate in the right direction because like we are supported well enough that we can really do the work that we want to do in the world that we believe to be actually towards healing our planet. So I think that there is a lot of hope, but it's one of these things where it takes a lot of the work is and the hardship is in the early days of figuring it all out and getting through this like super marginal, precarious part of the path until it's all built up enough that it becomes more useful. And it's the same with starting any kind of business, but it's easier to start a business and it's easier to do a lot of kinds of paths than this, in my opinion, because the incentive structures are such that it incentivizes me if I'm just looking out for this isolated, extricated part of the world, like of Larry and Larry's finances and Larry's ability to give to himself in a way that gives him the life that he wants. It'd be much easier for me to either start a company or just spend my time working at a large corporation or whatever it is than it is to like really pursue what I believe in. But I think we all need to be in this time when everything is at risk. We really need to be doing what we believe in, and then we'll find ourselves working together eventually, and it will become more useful. And it's certainly more joyful and beautiful to do this kind of work than it is to do something that's maybe more myopic and not as full of care and love.
So, given that you and I recognize myopia as constitutive to the disease, I want to try to carry us one level deeper into like a rigorous understanding of what we're facing here through a stereoscopic approach, not just you and me together on this conversation, not just us plus everyone that's listening. I want to take a couple of your passages from these 3 documents and string them together in a way that I create points on a plane that we can use as a lens to open up a little bit more about what you've written on communication and the issue of trust and the issue of being able to ground our understanding of perception and cause and effect. You say technologies of care perform best when they are grounded in reality, accountable to a diversity of perspectives, and enacted in the causal structure of karma. Just to plus one everything that you just said, I cannot think about anything that we've been talking about on this call without going back to Hannah Arendt and the banality of evil and the notion that, again, whether it's intentional or unintentional, and I got this from Ken Wilber in thinking about developmental psychology and how, in some perverse sense, people are always acting toward whatever they locally recognize as the good. And Ken's example was intense, but he makes the point that Nazis in a submarine in World War II are trying to win the war for their country and their way of life. And that if you are caught in the amygdala vortex of just simply trying to survive in a world as chaotic and unstable and precarious as our world seems to be, that drowning people tend to pull other people down under the water for air, but they're just doing what they need to do. So, this question of care being a function of our ability to coordinate perspectives is a piece of it, of being able to understand this cause and effect. That's all stuff that you've already said. And because, as you say on your website, communication bandwidth is proportional to conceptual alignment, one of the things that I get really hopeful about with respect to, because let's welcome hope into the room here, about artificial intelligence in particular as a technology of care, is that it can allow us to eventually, this, I believe, fully realized, this particular kind of tool allows us to translate things out of one person's conceptual framework and into someone else's, or one person's preferred sensory modality and into someone else's, and can, assuming this issue of we're not being lied to, we're not being hacked, that we can trust the intermediation of these communication technologies, can allow us to coordinate. And of course, this is like a huge issue that we're facing in society right now with misinformation and disinformation. So from there, to hop back into reality technologies and to get us a little closer to the understanding from which answers are going to arise here, you talk about perception as reliable information and reliable action as having the expected effect. And you say the classical technical understanding of information has nothing to say about where belief change comes from. It assumes you have a reliable base model. And this model has uncertainty reduced by the receipt of form. And that there's a critical distinction between change in belief and acquisition of knowledge. If you do not trust that an image of a tree was generated by a process originating in the existence of that tree, then you may not update your beliefs. In this case, you will not gain knowledge, regardless of whether that tree is present. If you believe that the image was generated by a causal process originating in that tree, but it was in fact synthesized by generative AI, you will update your belief but not gain knowledge. In fact, you will lose knowledge. So this is the I feel like these are the cataracts that we're trying to row our way through right now as a society. And you say coherence is causal consistency and that the truth is coherent with reality and ultimately causes less to produce. But then where I want to leave you in light of all of what I've just said is that, when I went to college to study evolutionary biology, one of the things that we could never get away from was that lying false signals in animals is an evolutionarily sustainable strategy, meaning that there will always be entities within that population for whom a false signal is less costly than the truth relative to immediate gain. So, yeah, again, we're lingering in this area, but when, as you say, like the plurality of perspectives is good, the lack of shared reality is a problem, and that we can develop the technology to construct an indisputable and shared picture of the nature of the world in a way that will support productive disagreement and communication. We have these two things. One is that we never have perfect knowledge, that if we're going to be rigorous about this, we have to accept that many of our beliefs are not actually grounded in a coherent causal understanding. And then part of that is because we're being lied to. And and that there is a sort of, I don't know, game theoretical justification for lying to other people and lying to ourselves. And it's not just people, it's entities at whatever scale. So again, I just want to hear you speak to this particular set of problems, one being the challenge of ground truthing what we're talking about, and the other in assuming no malevolence, we still have the issue of good intentions paving the road to hell. And then not all of those good intentions arise from self constructs with the same radius of care, and that we're always going to have cheaters in the system.
Yeah, great questions. So I think that I'm trying to push back on all of these ideas, and I think that these ideas emerge largely from the fact that I don't know exactly which like game theoretic lying phenomenon you're talking about, but I think I can talk about it anyways. We can try.
It
Um,
occurs between crabs and birds and other animals that don't even have what we think of as a self model.
yeah, sure. I think that these incentives emerge from myopic perspectives, and that like myopic perspectives are okay if you're in this domain where like evolution, I think actually like we have to go one step up. We have to ascend from evolution in a certain way because evolution has evolved us to be competitive, individualistic beings in a lot of ways. At least like biological evolution has incentivized this for probably the crabs that you're describing and lots of kinds of things. It works because individuals find ways to survive and then they survive amongst things. But there's also these relationships that evolve where care and mutual support does evolve. Sometimes it's within between beings of the same species or community. Sometimes it's like between beings that are very different. A bee and a flower, for instance, like these kinds of coevolutionary relationships. But I think like in the domains that we are in now, our actions have such a huge effect on others that there really isn't room for this inefficient solution. Like we have this inefficient prisoner's dilemma solution where if you can't find a way to coordinate and you can't incentivize other beings to work with you, then the solution is to do the thing that is selfish. We can talk about that as lying in this case. But really, the better solution, if you care about the whole system's value, is to somehow find a way to work together. And I think that the way you find to work together is by finding a way to care about the other being sufficiently such that their value function becomes part of your own value function. And this is where, like, this article that I'm writing right now called The Economics of Love falls in, where it's about like how do we extend our value functions through this process of growing understanding, care, and love such that they encompass the values of others. And therefore, I inherently care about the other crab. And therefore, there's a cost to me, not only in the risk of the other crab treating me poorly, treating them poorly or lying to them, but there's a cost to me in the other crab not getting something good. It's the same as a family. You're not going to compete with your children or your wife in a way that gets you something more than that at their expense because you actually care about them and you love them and they're a part of you in a real way. And so if we can figure out, I think really like we are all part of each other in a real way. There are no real lines that separate us in this system. So if we can find ways to live that way and act that way and understand that way and make it easier to support each other such that it's not so expensive to do that, then the real solution is actually truth. And I think that truth becomes possible through what I'm talking about in this reality technology paper, because you can actually start to, like, currently we live amongst, we're being, as you said, being lied to all the time, and we don't really have access to grounded truth. And so it's really hard to get a shared conception of reality. But I think technologies can be developed that change that. They change the economics of reality and of lying, and also make it just more available to make truth in some meaningful sense more available. And there's always going to be room for a diversity of perspectives because you're never going to have all the information. And there's also all sorts of ways of framing it and telling the story. And I think that diversity is very healthy, both in the systems perspective. Evolutionarily, diversity is healthy because it provides robustness to change. It provides more solutions to the problem and like a wider pool of solutions. I was writing about diversity recently. It's like another reason why diversity is healthy, and I'm forgetting. But anyway, I think that this is like the current situation, that it makes sense for me to lie currently, and I don't have access to truth currently. And therefore, all of the solutions that we find are ones that are worse for everyone. But it's my belief that we can develop technology that changes all the economics of all of this. And this is what I'm trying to write about in this Economics of Love paper, in the reality technology paper, in this whole book that stitches all of this together. And I think we can really build it.
I just want to double down on this because we were talking about this a little before the recording. You brought it up specifically that if you love someone, according to your definition, which is contingent on care, which is contingent on listening and truly understanding the needs of that entity, then you will not harm them. But I think everyone listening to this can find an example in their lives. I think a lot about parent-child relationships, and I have what I hope is adequate humility to realize that some of the things that I'm doing for what I believe to be the good of my own children are going to be things that they're going to be talking about with their therapists in 30 years or whatever. I want to connect this to what you've written about ownership and stewardship here, because you talk about ownership as total control over a being and stewardship as the responsibility to care, and that toxic ownership patterns include where the owner abuses or inadequately cares for the object and the object hurts the owner due to its not being well. I think about the term in law, jus utendi et abutendi, under which the owner, provided he harm no other, may destroy or annihilate that which belongs to him. But that's a rather large clause. That's what you're pointing to, is the provided he harm no other. And so it's, if we think about the idea that, I'm going to get a little radical here, the money that each of us has, which represents value that we acknowledge is an inadequately accounted measure of whatever actual value went into that, what we've been talking about this whole time, then when you see someone burn money on Instagram or whatever, when we see the conspicuous consumption, or this particular rocket is being fired by somebody who makes less money every year than the cost of their rocket, or and it's being fired at people who will make less money than the cost of their rocket in their entire lives. The nature of this disjunction, which right now I'm reading Any Human Power by Amanda Scott, which is a book about the death cult of the system that we have inherited, versus these attempts to create more conscientious and collective forms of economics and governance. And it's rendered in her story in a way that I think a lot of people listening to this understand as effectively an intergenerational argument, because the more money you have, the easier it becomes to rely on transactionality rather than relationality. And so you get situations like Doug Rushkoff's Survival of the Richest, where, or like, to bring it back to the LA fires, I've seen tweets from people that are asking, if money is no object, can I hire a private firefighting team to come put the fire out on my house? And so when you quote Torrey Hayden saying, safety is the most basic task of all. Without sense of safety, no growth can take place. Without safety, all energy goes to defense. Yeah, before we lean into your vision for how this can be done right, I think, like, I want some sort of answer about how you can love your kids, but somehow everywhere I look are parents that are not listening to their children when their children say, the world is on fire right now. How can you not make the coherent causal connection between the way that you are spending your money and the health and well-being of that which you claim to care for? And this seems to be a really intractable issue, because,
Yes.
as you say in the reality technologies piece, if the incentive to deceive is higher than the cost, it's difficult to trust that you won't be deceived. And there is also a degree of deception that corresponds to a cost for the perceiver to notice the deception. The final boss, I feel like, in the quest to create loving technologies and a holistic framework for this, is the epistemic issue that we're trying to pivot into, from a world where the way that we account for value has made it, there's like the hidden cost of the everything we, like you were saying much earlier in this conversation, the actual cost of everything you buy in the supermarket is much higher than
Yes.
what you actually pay. And so it's not just a problem of the stereotyped boomer mentality, that, like, all of us are in a system that the grain leads us to make decisions based on convenience that result in unintentional harm, even to those things that we believe that we care about. And so, just to wrap this up, when you say that the will to care is not simply a choice, but our duty as parts of the world, that, yeah, it seems like the work to understand all of this and actually practice it requires what are, for many people, impossible investments in the time and the attention that it takes to doubt our models well enough and to allow ourselves to be uncomfortable enough to really grok the essence of that which we ostensibly care for.
Yes. There's a lot here. I'm gonna try to answer as much as I can, and then if there's pieces that I'm missing that are important, let me know.
Yeah.
I find that I found a very consistent dynamical causal pattern that things that are broken, maybe we'll call them diseases, like, tend to get worse until you finally listen, especially things that are deeply broken. Like, it's just gonna keep getting worse until you're finally motivated to change. So sometimes things stay stable in like a sick way and things can be stably unwell. But in the case of a lot of real health problems or the situation that we're in with climate change and all the other intertwined crises, is going to keep getting worse until we finally listen. So, our duty is really to try as best as we can to listen as soon as we can and to make changes as soon as we can, both as individuals and as a society. Otherwise, it's going to keep getting worse until we're either forced to listen or we listen de facto by not being here anymore and not having a society anymore. And this is what happens, to not say it so bluntly, but it's what happens like with things like some of these fires. Like maybe we weren't even empowered to listen well enough, fast enough, because it's like really hard and it required too much societal shifts. But the climate is changing. These risks are real. And the risk keeps getting higher and higher until in the middle of January, we have the largest, most destructive fire LA has ever seen. It's hugely tragic. And it's not gonna be the last hugely tragic thing that happens if we don't really make changes, and so things are just gonna keep getting worse in various ways that are often hard to predict the individual instances of until we can listen and really make changes systemically. Different individuals have different proclivities towards being able to change and being able to listen or being willing or to change or listen. Some of them will unfortunately, tragically pass away before they're able to do so, or before they do so, whether they're able or willing or whatever it is. And so, what we can do is work our best as ourselves to really learn and invest in understanding what is required to make these changes to our world and to try to share this understanding as much as possible with the people around us or just the people we have the ability to influence, whether they're around us or somewhere else in the world. And so this is why I find myself so called to this kind of philosophical theory writing work, is because I found that there's something here that feels like I can make some difference and that I seem to be aligned in such a way from whatever proclivities I had and whatever path I happen to take to be able to be helpful here. So I'm going to do my best both to figure this out, to live it, and to articulate it and share it so that we can all make progress. And I'm going to be missing stuff and I'm going to fail in some ways. And so hopefully other people pick up the slack where I fail and we can all work together to do it. But I guess there were some other pieces here that were important. We're never going to not cause harm. So you talked about your kids, like how there's going to be something inevitably that they have to go to therapy for in 30 years. And I think that's probably true. I don't know of any, maybe very few counterexamples to this because we all come into the world carrying lots of trauma. And the best that we can do is reduce it to being less and better than it was before. My parents tried very hard and gave me so much and caused me lots of trauma. And so hopefully I've created a self that has less net trauma and more net understanding and care and ability to give than the generation before. So it's all about the net for all of this. I think if we punish ourselves, especially as we're embedded in a system where it is nearly inevitable that we're going to be causing harm on a daily basis, if we punish ourselves too much for that, then like we're not going to really have the will and ability to continue to work and do better. That's not going to work. So I think this is like psychology says self care, self forgiveness, and keep working and trying. And that's what I've decided to do is that I'm like, okay, I see enough here that it feels clear that I need to walk this path wherever it takes me. And I'm going to keep running into walls and probably causing harm, and it does happen. But I see over time it's less and fewer relationships have problems or get damaged, and there's more and more like love and care that gets built, and more things go well for me and for the people I'm connected to and the other systems that I'm connected to. And as we get better and better, things get more useful and things can accelerate. And I think that this is how, in my experience, a lot of healing works is like in the beginning, you're stuck and there's very little you can do. Like I've been in states where honestly, like I think probably many of us, like I'm spending all day in bed, really in pain, suffering, probably going through some mental thought loops and other kinds of things around fears and around bad habits and etc. Yet that's where I'm starting. And if I can make some progress by taking the right actions, by getting up and doing what I need to do some of the time, then and I can give things to future Larry such that future Larry has more resources, then it's a little easier for future Larry and future Larry will be better off. And it's not linear perfectly. It's like this. Hopefully it's getting better over time. And then eventually I'm healthier. And then eventually things start falling and cascading more in like bigger ways. And a lot of the things that are in the way start to just fall down and the progress becomes a lot more tangible and visible. And I think this is the way that healing works for any system, and it will have to work for our society. Is it's going to be a lot of time and energy that we put in that feels like it's not making any progress. And we're going to still, I mean, basically, no matter what we do right now, we're still going to have these fires for a little while, and we're still going to have all sorts of gnarly stuff happening. But if we keep working at it and we don't give up because we understand that the stakes are so high. I mean, it's really the stakes are like all the beauty in our world that we've come to love, whatever it is, whatever your particular thing that you love is that you care about, whether it's other people or just like some hobby or some natural land or some other kinds of creatures or anything. It's all at stake. And so if we can see that, then we can muster up the courage to keep moving towards doing better and caring more and working on our own fears and insecurities and things that are in our personal ways. And then eventually, the giant ship that we're on that has incredible momentum is going to start to turn. And eventually, it's all going to start to be better. And I really think there's a incredibly beautiful post disease world that we can have where things actually are working well and our society is full of people who have what they need, get to pursue beautiful lives that are unique and creative and whatever it is they're contributing, they're living in balance with the rest of the world. So all sorts of species and new kinds of socio-technical, political, environmental ecosystems emerge. And the kind of beauty that we can have, I think, can be incomprehensible, but it means that we have to do the really hard work today and now and keep doing it and be brave. And this is the kind of bravery that previous generations have had to have in face of a lot more tangible challenges like the Nazis that you mentioned, which is not really the people, the Nazis, as much as their ideology and behavior patterns and all of the things that have, you can think about it as like demons that have infected them and their society and caused them to act in these ways that were incredibly destructive, killed millions of my ancestors, etc. And but like today, it's not as obvious and clear as here is a society that's in this physical geographical position in the world that we can fight by building ships and tanks and bombs and all of this. It's like we actually have to fight the inner demons directly, which is like this demon of lack of understanding. It's this demon of thinking that this short-term thing, both short-term in time and myopic in space, of caring only for this local thing that is myself here and now, is somehow above understanding the bigger self and caring for the bigger self and trusting that by doing that, it's actually going to make me feel better in the long term because it'll be harder in the short term, but better in the long term. And if we can like really do that work, it's actually like we can all work out, I think.
So, in a lot of what you just said, there's a philosophy of investment with which I find myself very comfortable and I keep coming back to in the way I think about all of this. It's like, what makes listening hard is that listening is risky. Whether it's true or not, let's start by assuming it's not true in the long term,
Feels
but you
risky.
have to go through the dip. And
It's scary.
yeah, and so to articulate this with the overall motivation for this show, which is that we risk losing an opportunity to do truly beautiful and loving things with advanced technologies if we midwife them into the world afraid of what they will do, afraid of what they will become. Like, as you say, if we treat our new AI creations with curiosity and care, and if we build the principles of care into their definitions and code, then we will share a world with beautiful, weird new technological friends that care for us and the rest of the Earth system in turn. And yet, obviously, the whole conversation really is either in how can we use these things so that we can transcend everything in the world that makes us afraid? Or, oh my God, what are we doing? This is horrible. We need to spend all of our time calculating and preparing for various existential risks. And that is the bad trip, right? We're not regarding this stuff with curiosity and care. And so to go just briefly back to stewardship, you say, if I have not yet learned to listen, then I must not yet act. And to link it back to this question of the psychology, if you're talking about it as demon haunted psychology that fears the world so that it is myopically concerned with the accumulation of power, then even though it may seem to people without guns and bombs and money that those are unacceptable wastes. There's a gap there where it's like both sides of that conversation are focused on we cannot risk this. And I feel like we're pulling around the bend into the big question that keeps coming up again and again. And through the lens of that question, we can start talking a lot more about what concrete forms technological love actually embodies. The question to me seems to be one of how do we agree on what is at risk or what is at stake? And how do we make it possible for people to take risks in a safe way? I mean, it's like risk is inherently unsafe, but like, how do we make it easier for people to fail without the concern that no rebound is possible? And like the last thing I'll say about that is that when I spoke to Chaim Gingold about his book Building SimCity, there's a beautiful passage toward the end of that book on why SimCity is not a game, that it is a toy, because the game defines specific win and lose conditions and operates from a zero sum mentality. This is very parallel to James P. Cars's work on finite and infinite games. But Heim and the scholars that he references say that what Kars is calling an infinite game is actually play, in which there isn't really anything like failure, or failure is a learning opportunity. And this seems to be why power serves power and points to the beginning of an understanding of what it looks like to thread the needle of the polycrisis or the meta crisis. Now, my commitment with all of these conversations is to acknowledge the very real risks, but to do so in a way that encourages the kind of curiosity that is necessary for true listening, and to figure out how we reconcile the fact that this living through the sixth mass extinction, coming up with a just and equitable world is a very serious game. And yet, in order to thrive in that game, if not win per se, that it we have to engage it with a bit of non-attachment, enough non-attachment
Yes.
that the risk does not seem so overwhelming. I'd love to hear you speak to
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. That's very critical. to engage with non-attachment because, I mean, attachment, I spent a lot of time trying to define attachment. So I have two different definitions here. I haven't tuned this page fully, but it's disproportionate belief due to fear. It's when you believe something to a different degree than you have evidence for, like evidence in a Bayesian inference process, due to fear that the world may be different than you hope, wish, desire it to be. So it's like irrational belief, typically, if not always, due to some form of fear. And so irrational with respect to what? I think, like, in order to really get the structures of this game right, you really have to embrace this perspective that I am not separate or different or distinct, and, like, really dissolve this ego because that's part of this fear and irrationality. So attachment, I can be unattached to, I'm living in this house that I live in, which I love and I'm really grateful for. I can be unattached to various other things that I love and I'm grateful for, still pursue it. And I don't want to move, but if I need to, I have to not let it get in my way. And this is like extremely hard. And this is why this Buddhist enlightenment process, which I've come to view enlightenment as the lightening of attachment. It's like I'm no longer weighted down by all these things that I'm holding on to unnecessarily. That doesn't mean that I can't still move through the world based on what I believe and love and whatever. And so I don't, in theory, you can be enlightened in the world, but it's remarkably hard and often seems to occur more like as we get older and where like the inevitability of loss becomes like more and more stark and obvious and in your face. And then it's, oh, wait, I'm going to die anyways. I'm going to lose all these things anyways. Oh, wait, maybe I should remember to use this last year or whatever it is to care for my family, to give to my community, to all of these things. And the big tragedy here is that we don't realize this sooner. And so there's this huge individual work to let go of attachment so that we can really operate in a way that is good for ourselves as part of the world. And it's similarly at a societal level becoming more and more stark that we need to be unattached. If you were to either lose your house in a fire, which forces you to be unattached to that house, or you're just going to be mourning it your whole life, or to look at the risk of losing your house in a fire or a hurricane or a tornado or any other kind of catastrophe that like is becoming increasingly likely in basically all parts of the world. If you can accept that, acceptance is the opposite of attachment, then you can be like, okay, well, I live here. I love it. Maybe there's some better place to move because the risk is not something that I'm willing to assume, but you can make a rational decision about the risk that you're willing to assume and then continue to invest in making your house more fireproof or hurricane proof or whatever it is, and making yourself more safe and secure and whatever, so that you're able to, be more stable and do more work. If you don't have a stable base, you can't really move anything. It's both a physical law and at this metaphorical level, a law. This is why I've had to spend a lot of my time, I care so much about this writing, but I've had to spend disproportionate amounts of time sorting out my personal things like my health and home security and all of these kinds of things so that I feel stable enough to be able to do something, to be able to push on the world in some way. And yet it's intertwined with the pursuit of the work, because if I do the work better, then I'll have more security. So this is a challenging balance for me personally, is like, how do I do that? But in order to do all of this, there's like this separate dimension of non-attachment. So I think that the importance of safety and security is distinct from the costs of attachment. And both of them, like, it's important to invest in safety and security and stability, and for yourself and for the broader senses of self, which include your family, your community, and all of these things you care about, ideally, really, essentially not at the expense of others, but with others, because the solutions become, it's just cheaper to do things together. Like you mentioned this thing with this private firefighters, which is like, I hadn't heard that. That's seems reflective of the world that we live in. And if they could band together with their neighbors, it would be way cheaper for them all to invest in firefighting together, such that they aren't paying for these individual redundant personal costs, because all sorts of ways that this is very obviously redundant. And when you really look at that one step further, it's, oh, wait, how can we figure out how to invest in firefighting for the whole state altogether? So it's not just me buying personal firefighting so that I can survive and everybody else is fucked. Like, how about we all figure it out together? We need to get past that. And so much of that is like attachment to this self, which is the deepest form of attachment that we have. Is like, I am somehow more important or special or different than others. And like, when you look at this from like a Buddhist lens or like even like a rational lens, so I've come to call this like spiritual set of beliefs that are embedded in my way of thinking, like Bayesian Taoism, because I really think that these ideas are super intertwined if you look at them the right way. Like, it is, I am obviously not separate from the world. Like, I'm a material system made of the same atoms and stuff that is everywhere else in the world. I'm losing atoms and stuff all the time. I'm accumulating new atoms and stuff all the time. When I eat stuff, I came out of the atoms from the ground and the air and the water and all the food that I eat. I will go back to those things. If you ever try to define me as separate in any way, it's not possible to do. Like, you just basically have to come up with delusional ways of thinking in order to do that. So I'm clearly not separate. And there's all sorts of other ways to look at this. And it's really hard for us to get this because we have all this fear that is evolved in us for these reasons that you described. In order for me to persist long enough in a human form, in order to have come to be here, we've found this solution archetype where we're competing with each other, but it has created these toxic delusional beliefs that are now killing us. So if we can get rid of the attachment to the self, and there's tools for helping us do this, there's psychedelics and all sorts of things, there's philosophy, then we can start acting in a way that is beneficial towards the larger self, which we can start to be in economic alignment with by pursuing this growth of love process. So love, you mentioned also, I wanted to say, love is like, it's upon care, and that like care is when you're supporting the well-being of a being, but love is the situation that you find yourself in where you understand that other being to be enough of yourself that it is obvious to you, it is natural for you to support the well-being of the being, because it's actually just you're supporting the well-being of the self, and that love evolves through like these mutual care processes. If I understand my partner better, or anything or being that I'm potentially going to be in love with better, then I can care for it and support it. And then it can support me back. And we can find a solution such that the ratio of the amount that I get out of this relationship to the effort that I put in is less than, or better, more favorable than what it would be if we were acting separately and not together. And therefore, it's not just like I need this kind of spiritual sense of understanding that we're one being in one system, which is what a lot of the Buddhists talk about. But you can have this economic sense in which it is like actually better for me to invest in us together as a unit than, because I have enough understanding of them and they have enough understanding of me, and we built enough trust that in patterns of support that we're supporting each other in our own unique ways of being able to do that, which make it more efficient. So there's like a literal economic benefit of being in love. And then when we get this for larger and larger systems, like with this firefighting example, where you realize, oh, wait, if I care for my neighbors and they care for me, then everything's just going to be easier and better, whether it's like us cooking for each other or like going hiking together, taking each other's kids to like sporting events or whatever. It's like always better and easier if you can find enough mutual understanding to work together on this. Then like the obvious solution becomes to like pitch in on firefighting. And if you realize, hey, this doesn't just extend to us who happen to live together and have spent a lot of time together, but we can extend it through technologically supported understanding, which is a lot of the point of this technological love work, to a bigger and bigger set of pieces of a system, and eventually to societies, the whole world, then going in on a world government and world policies and global firefighting and whatever at the level of scale that makes sense, like, it's just this obvious way to solve our problems. And then as the UN stops being a thing where we're having to fight and put all this energy to just talk about stuff and maybe make real difference sometimes, but not nearly as much as we would dream of. It becomes, oh, wait, like Star Trek, actually, we need a global government. It's obvious we got past our individual unique scarcity fighting mode as a species. And there was lots of destruction caused, but hopefully less than there could have been. And we can actually have that. And yeah, I think I addressed a lot of what you were talking about, but let me know if I missed anything.
Yeah, yeah. I'm down to only one typewritten page of notes from your stuff at this point. So I can feel us getting closer to the light at the end of the tunnel and what all of this is really about, which is helping people form a clear image of the better world that we can participate in. But of course, there's the issue that you and I have both pointed to at various moments in this conversation, which is that what you're describing in my language is a major evolutionary transition in individuality where we like the cell participates in something like an economic arrangement with other cells to create the multicellular organism.
Yeah.
But we keep doing what Joshua DiCalio calls the scalar synecdoche, by which he means we can see that thing now with the help of technology, but we keep colonizing it with our own identity, with our own rules, with our own expectations. And so when people think about a global polity, they're imagining something that is writ large, like the way that Hobbes's Leviathan is. Well, we can see that society is a big body, but this is to justify the divine right of kingship in some sense. And this is the mistake that I think people make when Benjamin Olson said one of his favorite quotations is, "Who sees more is more right." That can be misunderstood to mean that the people who sit on the top of a status pyramid because they're seeing the abstractions. And here we are back to this thing. They've got the global economic dashboard in front of them. Therefore, they're justified to make decisions. And so that's the mistake we're trying not to make. Yeah, it's obvious in the way that you put it, the issue of safety and security are distinct from the cost of attachment. Like safety and security are short-term calculus, cost of attachment are a long-term calculus. And it's obvious now that private security is more expensive than a police force everywhere except in LA. But now it's obvious that's true even in LA because whoops, the police force came at the cost of the fire department. I want to link this back to something I brought up in my conversation with Jim O'Shaughnessy, and I don't know if we really reached a synthesis about this, but one of the main themes that I explore in this project is multi-scale regulation. Like I think about regulation as an emergent top-down form of causation and the evolutionary marketplace as the process by which that arises is like the bottom up thing. So even in your own brain, you've got different neural firing motifs competing in some sense to determine the behavior of the organism. But out of that process unfolding over evolutionary time, you have parts of the brain that are responsible for the inhibition of reflex behaviors that arise in the markets. Like everyone in finance is there to, it will quickly admit that markets are crazy and yet that markets are creative. And you look at the Dow Jones or like crypto, and it's obvious it's this huge limbic system, but like people are justifiably concerned that captured regulatory frameworks that are shaped by the distribution of power in economic markets are going to determine the laws that exist in order to regulate the market. And so when I hear you talk about, well, obviously, if you can dilate your perspective or coordinate enough perspectives enough, it becomes self evident that it's much cheaper to just pay taxes, except in such cases where your tax dollars end up being appropriated by the concerns of the
Yes.
military industrial complex and its preoccupation with the boundary maintenance of your society. And I bring all of this up because I want to make a bold claim here, which is that regulatory bodies emerge, like the government, the state emerges as a consequence of the economic benefit of love. That's what I heard you just say. And yet, in your piece on Hurry Up, We're Dreaming, you spend, there's three little things I want to talk about with you. And I think the last two will be very quick. But this one is interesting to me because I am not saying that we can ever expect to have a world in which teeth exist, claws exist, animals in even in this cooperative world that we live in that's defined by symbiotic relationships, we're going to have competition and cooperation coexisting at all times. And you talk about how understanding is required to provide stable and consistent care, but it's not sufficient. We must also respect every being and their right to self determination. And so, this is again, the perennial philosophical concern that I hear people in the agentic tech space working out. I hear the folks I know at Cosmos Institute asking about how we design technologies that foster human autonomy and freedom. And you say technologies that support respect include governments, law, police, prisons, parking meters, locks, security cameras, military, and weaponry. At first glance, it may sound like these have nothing to do with love. However, they are tools that help us to feel safe and which create incentive for others to respect us. Many of these technologies are controversial because they are challenging to design and implement, and when they don't work as they should, they impinge on our well being and cause harm. The key is mutual respect. So, one thing that we haven't talked about exactly, we've talked a lot about care and understanding. And then there's the matter of the relationship between, well, I hate to put it this way, but it's because you said it's not as simple as it was in World War II. And it's certainly not. Like the assassination of the United Healthcare CEO did not lead to its presumed intentional effect in as much as it didn't send a message to CEOs that they should be less concerned with
Yeah.
private security. And it certainly didn't cause anyone among the, I think, 0.01% to think, my gosh, I should actually respect human life and dignity because it was itself not an act of the respect for life and
Yes.
human dignity. So when you say we must design far more nuanced and gentle technologies to mediate respect, and this will help us on our way to love, I'm curious how you see this in very tangible terms. Like, what does it mean? Like, what is the evolution of weaponry and law and the enforcement of law look like in your framework?
Yeah.
Or you talk about karma technologies showing us the impacts of our actions. And just as an like appendix to that question, one of my favorite science fiction trilogies is The Golden Ecumen by John C. Wright, who was a lawyer working at the time that he wrote those books. And in his post-human utopia, when you are convicted of a crime, the punishment is to experience everything that you subjected your victims to, because
Yeah.
everybody is recorded. And so they
Very
can just copy
Rawlsian.
paste what you did to someone into
Yeah.
your own mind. And that's an example, I think, of
Yeah.
something like that.
I like that. That's very Rawlsian in this nice, what do they call it? Veil of ignorance kind of way. What does the evolution of weaponry and law and the enforcement of law look like in my framework? I think I'm not an expert in all of this. So I mean, I have some answers, and this is a place where I don't have full understanding. And so I'm not going to like pitch a full solution because it's not my domain. And it does seem clear we need to find a way to actually incentivize people to do things that are good for the system. So, in a gentler sense, this means that if you're causing harm to others, you shouldn't have to pay for that harm in some way. And if you're creating value for others, you should participate in that value in some way. And I think that at some level, a lot of this is like what taxes and like government want to be doing, but nobody seems to have figured out some of this in like the simplest essence such that it's like actually built, or if it is articulated, it's in some way that is far enough from the mainstream that I haven't encountered it. And like most people who make laws seem to not have encountered it, because making taxes and laws seems to be really the Wild West, in part because people can get away with it, and but in part because there doesn't seem like this guiding theory even about what is a good tax, what is a good law, what is a good punishment. And so in the cases where you don't have to resort to punish like serious like punishment like jail time and like all of this, where you can actually people can actually afford to pay back the thing, then it feels like the at least the theoretical abstract answer is relatively straightforward, that you should have to pay society back at least for the cost of the negative impact that you have, probably rounding up for inefficiencies so that you're going to net out better, so that the world's going to net out better. And like the better we get this system at accounting, the fewer the inefficiencies are, the lower the cost, and also the more accurate it is. And then also you should participate in the benefits. And so incentives like negative taxes, et cetera, should exist for the things that we're doing that are good. And sometimes that's another problem, is like we don't actually participate in the benefits. I think we do often more than we think we do because of like karmic dynamics, is what I call it. But really, just so there are lots of stable patterns of if I am doing something kind for you, it will probably benefit me in some way, even if it's hard for me to recognize the exact like pattern or dynamical like system that gave rise to it benefiting me. It like tends to benefit me. And I think this is true. But in cases where I don't have the ability to pay back the thing. So if I'm either too poor, or if I've caused like the kind of harm that there is no obvious like way to do restitution, murder, for instance, like the example you gave, then you at least want to both try to get as much restitution as possible. And prisons, I think like the value of prisons is in like preventing future harm. I think that they're really not done well in so many ways, but if you can prevent people from doing future harm by separating them from society, then that's valuable. But you don't have to separate them in a way that is like just going to be worse for them long term and perpetuate the harm. You could probably separate them in a way that allows them to learn, whether it's like in the example that you gave from the science fiction thing where they have to experience it, that and that's both punishment and hopefully a lesson. But you could probably teach them lessons in a lot more ways than we're doing right now. And this exists obviously in some societies. I'm not a super expert in this, but I know that there are, I forget they call this. I mean, there's also terms for a lot of this, like restorative justice, et cetera. And I think you somehow have to figure out how to account for some of these things beyond the individual. But hopefully, if you get this stuff stable enough, people will not even decide to do all these harmful things because it'll be clearly disincentivized. And like things like shooting a healthcare CEO, like that is seems to be out of so much rage and anger and whatever, that both it has not the desired effect, whether whatever they intended, who knows, but it's not going to cause positive benefit in this direct way because people are going to respond in fear, just because fear tends to beget fear in this same kind of there's these karmic patterns. But if the person wasn't in this horrible situation in the first place because society was working better, then probably they wouldn't have gotten that far. So the rate of these kinds of things that are like impossible to pay back would hopefully go down so much that, yeah, you have to like do something about it, but it's not going to be this major societal issue, one would hope. And also, like, it's all amplified by power. So they have the ability to do this because they have tools like guns. And if we have all these powerful technologies without the requisite understanding, then these kinds of things are going to happen. There's things like this with guns, but then there's like far more powerful technologies like certain kinds of uses of AI, nuclear weapons, et cetera. And these are where it gets really scary because you can't pay back beginning a nuclear war. Like it's not possible, or like causing the extinction of a species, things like this, the complete destruction of a major ecosystem. And so we somehow have to focus a little less on punishing the people who did it, and you still have to do that, but more on just like somehow preventing them from doing this by helping them to be well and listening to them sooner. If people were able to listen, I'm sure there's been huge amounts of complaints and outcry and everything about the way that United Healthcare was operating. If we were able to listen sooner to things like that, then we wouldn't be in a situation where it's so bad that somebody felt that desperate that they decided to make this choice. And hopefully we can do this at a geopolitical scale sufficiently that not only does nobody decide to use nuclear weapons, God forbid, but that nobody's even scared that anybody's going to decide to use nuclear weapons because everyone feels heard and supported. And if there's some real problem that they're facing, they're either getting what they need or they feel like they're getting everything that can be done and therefore they don't feel the need to lash out. I don't think it is inevitable that we have this level of deep suffering that causes us to contemplate these decisions and to fear the consequences of other people contemplating these decisions. I'm forgetting if there was some other thing that I'm missing here that you said a lot of things, but I think that
No, and though some may believe it impossible, I wanna just spiral one level deeper into this subdomain, 'cause, this whole question of listening sooner, like, the fact that we don't often participate in the benefits, as you said, like, the very reason that money and law seem to exist is because of the fact that we have scaled social interaction beyond our ability to trust. And you say, we can only enter love when we are able to fully trust the other being to do what is best for the joint self, including for you, so that you might be well together through trust and understanding. And this brings me back through the last pass on what you've written about trust technologies, about the what you call channel-based trust, about the structure of the message itself, which we've lost to a great extent through digital image and video and audio manipulation, and efforts like those of Pooja Olhaver, who I hope to have on the show, who wrote the paper on the decentralized society with Glenn Weil and Vitalik Buterin, and the idea that we can basically create a new form of credentialing through trust-based systems that decouple prestige from the reliability of a message. And I won't go into all of that now, but like I saw that there's this huge gap in our thinking right now between intersubjective trust and objective empirical validity, and that work like hers seems to bridge that. But you make the point that, sorry, yeah, I said channel based, I meant content based trust earlier, content based trust tools. And then there's this bridge between channel based trust, which is intersubjective, and coherence based trust, which is based on the causal coherence of things. And you say, while this principle has been around at least since humans began to communicate, it has not been formally integrated into trust tools. So I see something there. And this thing about trust and coherence and your comment about restorative justice, I want to bring it all the way back around to where we started this, about looking at the health of society and of our planet as through the same logic that we think about the holistic systemic health of the body. That again, what the United Healthcare allopathic medicine framework is something like the criminal justice system, in which imprisonment actually costs more now than the crime. Where it's chemotherapy, it might work, but what you're not doing is remediating the cells that are out of balance. You're like blaming the cancer, but it's like everybody knows that you having cancer isn't cancer's fault. It's because of some structural issue in your genes, your diet, your behavior, your physical environment. And chemotherapy doesn't address any of those. And so, yeah, the last piece is all of these issues seem like they bottom out in a question about coordination, like really what it's all about is the meta crisis is fundamentally a crisis of trust debt. And that's where we ask ourselves, how do we rebuild trust person to person, between people in our institutions, between the human world and the non-human world that obviously unless if you're an animal, like unless you live in the Galapagos, you don't trust people. How do we begin the long, slow, inconvenient, and risky work of starting to regenerate trust in all of these areas that we have damaged it?
Yeah, so I think a lot about coordination, and I think this is a really critical layer of abstraction, but I don't think this is where it bottoms out. I think that coordination is made possible by understanding. And there's a lot of other things that kind of come out of understanding. But when it's not rooted in the fundamentals, like there's nothing, you don't make progress in the whole system. And so for me, it's not just understanding, but it's holistic understanding. So it's understanding, yes, of the part that you care about, yes, of the cancer, but really not of the cancer separated from the system, but the cancer as part of the whole system, like you said. And for the medical issues that I've dealt with, which thank God have been not as challenging as cancer and not as existential, they are incredibly complex and systemic. And so the only way I was able to make progress is by looking at the whole system and trying to figure out what's forcing what and what's causing what. And usually things tend to like self reinforce. So all sorts of things were self reinforcing each other. And then figuring out how do I change the behavior of this system, sometimes slowly to start or by making changes in parts of it so that I can get the dynamics to shift. And so with this cancer thing, yeah, maybe you actually do have to do something about the cancer that's already there. And maybe it's irradiated, maybe it's something else. But you also have to do something about the process that's causing the cancer. And if you think about this at a societal level, the solution that we understand but haven't figured out how to implement is get people to stop eating so poorly, get people to care for themselves and really build systems that help people to care for themselves and to eat better and to not eat things that are like full of toxic chemicals or be exposed to toxic things in various ways or to participate in behaviors that are causing this. And it's all there's the level of the what local process is causing this person to get this and how can we extricate them from this process. I don't know that much about cancer. It's like the advice of somebody who has heart attacks to avoid eating steaks, if that's even still a real thing, I don't know, but fix cholesterol through your diet. But like, how do you actually embed them in a system where their social structure is not based around like going to steakhouses to have business meetings? Like, how do you get them so that their social structure makes it easier for that to happen? How do you build the whole society in such a way where like the incentivized natural behavior is something that is healthy? And if we can figure that out, the cost savings is enormous. Like, not only do you not have people who are as unhealthy, but like all the costs that we're sinking into treating all these people in this very myopic local way by spending insane amounts of money on healthcare because our society is making everybody sick in a very consistent way, those all evaporate. So I think really it's all about understanding, whether it's of the system and the details and dynamics of it, or of the principles that underlie the system, that underlie just your metaphysics or your epistemology or something like understanding that I am not a separate being, all of this kind of thing. The word understanding is used in many ways here because it really like applies to all of the senses of understanding, and we need all of them. Understanding each other, understanding oneself, understanding one's impact on the world, understanding the nature of the world. And if we can understand really the dynamics and stop being so myopic about it, and we're incentivized to do that right now because there's cost benefit incentives for the local pharmaceutical company to push drugs instead of dietary changes because they want to continue to exist, et cetera. But if we can somehow reshape all of that, then it's not all that crazy and you can avoid the need for like imprisonment and whatever. And there's still a role. I'm not usually anti all of these things, especially in the context of our world. I don't think that we should just get rid of guns and bombs and like all of these things because we need them right now to maintain stability. But in the world that we're aiming for, that we're trying to evolve into, they no longer become necessary. Allopathic medicine is really powerful and useful, but it can't be used outside of the context of an understanding of the system, because then it's insanely expensive and doesn't even solve the problem. So in my healing journey personally, I've had to make use of both allopathic medicine and holistic medicine. And often we tend to tribalize and fight for one thing versus the other, but this misses the point. Like, really, it all fits together into a puzzle. And picking a side is just choosing to align oneself with a bigger self that is at odds with a different other. And then you're still splitting the world unnaturally and creating this war based way of acting, this conflict-based way of acting instead of cooperative way of acting. And it's really a radical shift for us. And so this is why it's so hard, because we don't think this way in our society. And like the people who did think a lot more like this, even though probably not always 100%, we killed them. A lot of the Native Americans and a lot of the Native like cultures, because they're not investing in fighting. So when you're fighting them, they're going to go away. And then we realized later that they were actually right and that we needed them. And but it's not too late, and we can still learn, and, like, the ability to change is still present, the ability to learn a new way is still present. I promise that it's really beautiful. This has inspired my life to see more and more of this picture, and there's still so much that I'm missing, but just the more I see, the more beautiful it becomes, and it's, wait, actually, there is a completely coherent other way of thinking about the world that is cooperative and supportive, that solves a lot of these things that we tend to think are fundamental challenges, the prisoner's dilemma, or like the tragedy of the commons, or the fact that our world is sick and diseased and that we're in a meta crisis. It's not inevitable. And like by investing and understanding and really trying to do things right and take a breath and be like, okay, we can afford to slow down just a little bit so that we can actually think about the actions that we're taking and figure out a good way forward. I promise you the world's not going to disappear tomorrow. If we continue to ignore it, like, it's going to slowly rot. But if we can say, okay, I'm no longer in this fight or flight mode. I am safe. I am here. I have what I need right now, which is true for many of us, and in some sense is true for all of us. Then we can really gather ourselves and start to let go and shed this attachment and these fears and start to really work together on a better way, which is just, it's more fun doing stuff together anyway. So everything's going to be like more joyful this way too. So it's not, oh, I have to work so hard and strive and fight to make this thing better. Like most of the real fighting that we have to do is with our demons. And I think the way to win those battles tends to be to like find ways of letting them go instead of fighting them like a battle anyways. So in a lot of these personal senses, I don't know that I can say much better than a lot of the great Buddhist thinkers and Taoist thinkers and people from really all backgrounds and religions, people in Christian tradition, Muslim tradition, Jewish tradition, who speak beautiful, great wisdom about all of this. We just need to find whatever calls to us that is about nonviolence and about being together, and use that as a starting point towards this journey that we all have to undertake in order to either grow a better world or at least do everything we can towards that mission, because what other mission is actually worthy?
Amen. And yes, I feel like I've made a great mistake in this conversation in the allocation of my attention and the emphasis that we have paid here to the map of the problematique and the apparent tension between these things. And I really thank you for making sure to emphasize that this is a both and thing. Just in closing, I would invite you in whatever way you feel is right. You just done a bit of this already, but what I would like to invite you to do in this final stretch is to say, if people are having that kind of a bad trip, how do you, what is your protocol for helping someone rediscover the mindfulness or the curiosity or the presence that allows them to be capacious enough to sit with the trouble and find space in themselves, find the good trip amidst all of this. Because it's clear, like, I think you and I have both said that it's not through dissociation, it's not through bypassing, it's not through the negation of the problem. Slowing down helps, but when you're in that state, it doesn't feel possible. So, like, how do you in your own life and with those that you care for find room for these things?
It's a beautiful question. First, I don't know that it was a great mistake that you made because I think that most of us are coming from this perspective. And in order to feel like safe in to embrace this possibility that things like can actually all fit together, we have to have all of these questions met. And so this journey we just went on was an experience of us working through all of that. And I don't know if there's another way to get there. So I think thank you for pushing me on all of this. And I think we got to do that together. And that's how my journey has gone too. It's just like pushing on all of it. And I think for me, like in these personal, how do I stay present? How do I, because it's not like I believe all these things, but I have plenty of time where like I'm not feeling this day to day and it's quite challenging. There's the one level, which is the belief, which is all of these things that I've said, plus just like all of the philosophy around this. Then there's the practice, which can be grounded in belief. So you can have principles like the things that Eckhart Tolle talks about, of power of now, which I think is like incredibly simple and beautiful and true philosophy. There is only now. Everything else is a construct. But there is some sense in which there's a future, but you're never in the future. Any like conception that you have of the future is just your model of the future, and you're never in the past. Any conception of the past that you have is just your model of the past, which is constructed from traces that have been left around in your memories and traces that have been left around in the memories of the world. So, like, it's not really there. And the only thing that you can directly act on and act in is the present. So, knowing this can help. But there's also like the embodied practices of this, of which I continue to get better and like I'm still not nearly as expert in as a lot of other people I know, of meditation, of finding all of the things that resonate with you. There's all sorts of kinds of meditation. So I think some people, including myself, often try a kind of meditation and it's really not working. And it's like, then you give up on at least it as a regular practice. And just knowing that there's not just one way of doing this, there's all sorts of different ways and exploring what works for you. And I think the essence of it is really some way that allows you to be present without attachment. And so whether that's just focusing on your breathing or practicing letting go of like thoughts that come in or just noticing them and allowing, thanking them. And then that lets you stop holding on or like moving meditations like yoga. I really love to go for walks. Walks to me are really powerful. Spending time with friends. I think all sorts of like activities are really great. And then what kind of keeps me like the maybe star for all of this is just like appreciating the beauty of the world. Like live in such a beautiful, magical world. And so taking time to really just enjoy it. And I feel really grateful that I live in Berkeley where so many people care for this city and whether it's their own houses or their yards and like all the crazy different diverse plants and all the animals that are around and all the different kinds of art that people make. And I just walk around sometimes and just appreciate all of that. And that really helps me. But wherever you are, there's so much beauty in our world. And this is what we're fighting for. And this is why all of this matters, is because it's all just really magical and beautiful. And so there's really no point in spending all of your energy scared and fighting for all this stuff if you don't get to enjoy it. So just grounding in the enjoyment, I think, is actually maybe the step towards feeling motivated to do stuff to make it continue to exist, which is really what we're fighting for here. It's to continue all of the beauty that we have and then to allow more kinds of unique, diverse beauty to emerge because it's supported, because like we're operating in a way that is like caring and loving and all of this. So that's my best way. And I trying to get better every day. And there's days that are I'm not very good at this, and I'm I don't always have gratitude and see the beauty, and then there's days where I do, and I don't know, just trying to choose when you notice the opportunity to choose to, like, appreciate and be grateful.
I might have to put that right at the top of the episode. Just before I let you go, I would love to know, for the sake of your work and the possibility of collaboration, like, where are you with this?
Ooh,
And what kind of help do you think you need to really bring this into fruit? And then in parting, I would love your recommendations for like up to 3 women or elders that you really respect that you would recommend on the show.
okay. Where am I in my work? So, I've written and released not nearly as much as I would like to recently. There's that Hurry Up, We're Dreaming article. There's this pre-alpha version of this website, which is mind.technological.love. That will continue to evolve over time. And if I get like feedback and thoughts about it, like that, I think will probably give me more energy, both on the piece and the website. If people are engaging in this beautiful way that you just did, that makes me feel like, wow, actually this matters. And then it's easier for me to do more of it. So that's like a very simple way to support. Financial support is always valuable. I don't currently have a great mechanism for that, but if it feels like there's a will for that, we can construct a mechanism. Anybody who has ideas about how they can help, I mean, I'm always open to it. I'm trying to make like better websites or have more collaboration on different kinds of things. So, but yeah, resources are always helpful because then I can engage friends and help support them in us all working together on some mutual solution, whether it's around my work or their work or both of ours together in some way. Feeling safe and not being stressed about rent and all of the other things that are super expensive these days is always helpful. But I also, I've, like all of us, I'm figuring it out and I'm fine for now. So, and hopefully it'll continue to get more and more abundant. In terms of women and elders, I'd have to think for a minute. The person who pops into my head immediately who would be amazing would be Robin Wall Kimmerer, writes in such an incredibly beautiful way and is so wise. Just that would be an absolute joy, I think, to have. I'm kind of like, I want to look at my books real fast. Can I walk over there and look at my books and let you know? There's a lot of people who I don't know quite if they're alive still, like elders who I respect. Like I just found, I think she's probably no longer alive, like Rachel Carson, amazing. But what's her name? Jessica Fern is like different, I think. She does Polysecure and she wrote another book recently. It's just a beautiful new way of thinking about relationships and relationality and shedding a lot of the kinds of structures that we already have and trying to like find the essences of what it means to have a good supportive relationship that's secure. And so I think that could contribute nicely to the conversation. What is her name? I don't know if you seems like somebody you might have already spoken with. I don't know, but Sophie Strand would probably be a great person.
She's on the list. Yeah.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
There's probably more that I could think of later, but that's who comes to mind immediately.
Those are great, man. Thank you so much for the longest episode to date. We knew that this was going to take a while to unpack. And honestly, I don't know how much justice I've given to your very methodical and deliberate unpacking of this material. So obviously, I encourage people to read your stuff and seek you out and stay tuned in to what you're doing. So I'm glad to know you. And I think eventually our root tips will grow together in this
Yes,
work at some point.
I think
So
so.
thanks a lot, man. Take
Thanks.
care.
Thank you. This has been really lovely. And I feel really seen and supported with this. And if we need to dig in more, I'm always around. We can do more. So, yeah.
Thanks again for listening. Humans on the Loop is a listener supported project committed to helping us dream better together. If you liked this episode, please subscribe and review the show wherever you listen. And visit humansontheloop.com to dig into the archives and explore the benefits of membership. On the website, you'll find extensive citations, our interactive knowledge graph, and a link to the Wisdom and Technology Discord server. Our next dialogue is with Sam Arbisman, resident scientist at Lux Capital and author of The Magic of Code. We'll interrogate the distinctions between software and spellcraft, explore the unique blessings and challenges of a world defined by advanced computing, and probe the good, bad, and ugly of futures that move at the speed of thought. Stay tuned and remember, imagination and attention are our greatest natural resources.